Yikes. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Day Drinking with Authors, the podcast and interview series in which I pick a book, the author picks a drink, and we discuss both. And it's really interesting in the course of doing this interview series, and I mean, dozens and dozens of authors. And I ask them each time, in projects going forward, are you going to talk about the pandemic, or are you going to, I talk to a lot of romance authors, a lot of women's fiction authors, or are you going to, push the pandemic aside and continue, life without, what we've gone through? And I get a lot of mixed answers, but most authors are saying no, they're not going to deal with it, which is an interesting choice. And I totally support it and understand that. And so when I started to read this week's book, which is called Doctors and Friends by Kimmery Martin, I was like, wow, okay, here we go. It's a book about not our pandemic, but about a pandemic. And I have to say, it was so cathartic. It was so emotional. It was so important to read this book. And the things that were really, the things that were really emotional and that I was invested in were the things that my family had experienced. So I encourage everybody to go grab this book, because it really does frame some things in my mind, your mind, hopefully too, about what happened to us and about what happened to doctors and nurses. I mean, if you, like me, were lucky enough to be pretty unfazed through all of this, I don't know, it's just a really important look at what is going on the front lines of a pandemic. Not our pandemic, but a pandemic. So I'm going to read the back cover copy for my mom, who would love this book. And this is a good book club book, Mom. So don't sleep on it. Doctors and Friends. Hannah, Compton, and Kira have been close friends since medical school, reuniting once a year for a much-needed vacation. Just as they gather to travel in Spain, an outbreak of a fast-spreading virus throws the world into chaos. When Compton Winfield returns to her job as an ER doctor in New York City, she finds a city changed beyond recognition and a personal loss so gutting it reshapes every aspect of her life. Hannah Greer's career as an OBGYN in San Diego is fulfilling, but she's always longed for a child of her own. After years of trying, Hannah discovers she's expecting a baby just as the disease engulfs her city. Kira Marchand, an infectious disease doctor at the CDC in Atlanta, finds herself at the center of the American response to the terrifying new illness. Her professional battle turns personal when she must decide whether her children will receive an experimental but potentially life-saving treatment. Written prior to COVID-19 by a former emergency medicine physician, Doctors and Friends incorporates unexpected wit, razor-edged poignancy, and a deeply relatable cast of characters who provoke both laughter and tears. Martin provides a unique insider's perspective into the world of medical professionals working to save lives during the most difficult situations of their careers. So let me welcome Kimmery to the show. Hi, Kimmery.
Hi, Molly.
Thanks so much for being here. And thanks so much for this really powerful book. And you talk about how you started writing this book in like 2018. So before our COVID, but there had to be a huge part of the process written during the pandemic.
Yeah, so I had the idea in 2018. I think I was writing an article about the next book I was going to write. And I pitched the idea to my editor and researched it, drafted it, and sold it to the publisher in 2019. So it was the world's worst timing. We did a lot of revision. Yeah. No, literally. I think I was wrapping it up in early 2020, February 2020. And I was on a book tour for my second novel in late February, early March 2020. And I was literally in New York City the first week of March, the day before everything shut down. And it was sinking in that what was happening was not going to be some easily controlled or regional outbreak. It was going to reshape everything. And so we had to decide whether or not to go forward with the publication of Doctors and Friends.
So, like, what was that conversation like?
Well, as you know, Molly, the wheels of publishing turn very slowly. And unlike my other job, emergency medicine, where you're running around like you're on fire. So we knew that by the time everyone read this novel, they would be seeing it through the filter of their own experience living through a real life pandemic. There's no way anybody can read this book and not relate it to what we've all experienced now. So ultimately, they did decide to publish it, as you know, which is not a mystery to anyone, since you're holding it right now. But my editor asked me to revise it a little bit, and so the original pitch for the book, and this is going to make you cringe, but the original pitch for the book was The Hot Zone meets Sophie's Choice. And it still has that plot line. So, like
pre-pandemic, that sells. Sign me up, that sells. But post-pandemic, that's a typical read.
Yeah. So, if you read those two books, you know that this book is about a pandemic, and the main character in the book is an infectious disease doctor at the CDC in Atlanta. And she is instrumental in formulating the American response to this virus, because it's her specialty, this fictional virus that takes over the world in the book. But near the end of the pandemic, her two children, a little boy and a teenage girl, both become deathly ill with the virus. And she just happens to have access to one dose of an experimental antiviral medication, and she has to select which child is going to get it. So that was the original premise of the book, and that plot line is still in there. And I can tell you, Molly, even though I know it sounds implausible, there was a real life inspiration for that plot line. But before I tell you that, I'll answer your question and say that we did revise the book in 2020. My editor asked me to rewrite it so that, because we were all going to read it having experienced a pandemic, we wanted to emphasize that not everyone has experienced a pandemic on the front lines. So she asked me to revise it, showing the perspective of other physicians. So now there's this ER doctor and this OBGYN who are also have their own plot lines and their own story arcs.
That's a major revision. I mean, you're adding thousands of words. I mean, particularly for Comfort. I'm sorry, Compton, who is the ER doctor. Like, I mean, a whole nother world of research. I mean, that must have been an intense revision.
It was, although both characters were already in the book, you just didn't see from their direct perspective in the original drafts. So actually, I think it made it a much stronger read to show their points of view. And, I did actually really research Compton's role in the book. Even though I am an emergency medicine doctor myself, I crowdsourced a ton of ER doctors throughout 2020, well, before and during 2020. And so I was reading all these anguished emails in real time, especially from people in New York and some of the places that were hit hard early on during COVID. So that did really affect the revision of the book.
And they were really powerful. I mean, they were really powerful additions. I mean, excellent choice to include those. And I mean, you honestly can't say enough. As much as any of us watched the news, or I have a friend who works at a hospital in Detroit. As much as she's telling me what's going on, this felt so visceral and real. And I wondered, and on top of it, was kind of funny. You really managed that, obviously, that dark humor. But there's that scene where she gets out of the shower and she doesn't have any clothes, and she finds like a doctor's lab coat, and she just goes through New York City. It's like nothing on underneath, lab coat. Was that a story someone had told you?
I don't remember. I don't remember where that came from, honestly. I mean, I do remember, I guess, in my own experience, becoming befouled at work. And so what I guess I thought was, well, there aren't going to be environmental services people laundering all the scrubs during all of this, so she's going to not have anything else to put on. Yeah, I can remember several times in my career where I really needed to change clothes.
Well, and I felt like you I mean, there were so many, as there is in this pandemic, there's so many little places of heartbreak. These moms with kids at home who are also at homes, who are supposed to be, online school, and the nightmare that all was. Like you used all of that to really keep this fueled. And the other question that I had, well, I have a lot of questions for you, but the other one that I have was, you are an emergency room doctor, but you dug deep into infectious disease and like global response teams. What was the research like for that?
It was fascinating. So I have long been interested in infectious disease. Was really interested in the 1918 influenza pandemic. I read The Great Influenza by John M. Barry years
Yeah,
ago,
I
and
did
it had
too.
this
Yeah.
massive impact on my imagination. I'm interested in epidemiology, so I wound up crowdsourcing a big group of infectious disease doctors, epidemiologists, virologists. I read a ton of books. I read a ton of journal articles. And I got interested in this little subset of the CDC called the EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And it's this real group that is trained to constrain and investigate disease outbreak. And so it's like a fellowship almost. And they're not all exclusively doctors. You know, there are some of the people who have done EIS training are veterinarians or nurses. There was even a lawyer who went through the program once, but most of them are physicians. And it just seemed like such a badass job. And so I read a bunch of books about the EIS and I talked to people who had worked in it. And so most of that stuff I did in 2019. And then those people got really busy and it was harder to get in touch with
didn't have time to respond to your, so in your drafting of this, and you make a funny note of it in your author's note, how hard was it to keep that? I mean, every author who loves the research that they've done and thinks all of it is so fascinating wants to convey all of it to the reader, and it is not fascinating. And so
information dumps, yeah.
How hard was it to pull that back?
Well, really hard for me because I am wordy to start with, and I am nerdy as all get out. And so somebody has to rein me in, and that's the job of my long-suffering editor at Berkeley. Her name's Carrie. She does a wonderful job of cutting me down.
No one cares about this.
Kill your darlings. But I mean, no, I like reading books where you are fully immersed in some technical subject or some setting or some industry that the protagonist knows really, really well. And I like that authenticity that you get with the real language and lingo and that kind of thing. But you're obviously going to bore your reader to tears if you include too much of it. And I think I said in the author's note, also scientists are always trying to qualify their statements to be maximally accurate, whereas writers are weak if they include a bunch of adverbs and maybes and almosts. And, so I was constantly trying to balance being accurate in the medical statements without literally causing people to go unconscious as they read this.
Well, it was a really interesting dichotomy. I felt in so many ways around the science and around the medical stuff that you were just a little bit ahead of the reader, which I loved. It made me feel smart, and and then at the same time you had this push behind of this big emotional thing that was going to happen. And was that a difficult push-pull to manage? Were you able to get that push-pull down in your first draft, or was that a thing that came through editing? Like, how did that, or it was just the hot zone meets Sophie's Choice? It was baked into the premise.
It was baked into the premise. In that sense, it was an easy book to write because it was really drawing on emotions that feels. We all love our children. We're all stricken with horror at the thought of having to choose between them. We're all aware of the threat of illness and death, and so those themes were very easy to pull into. For me, I think probably one of the biggest themes of the book is this concept of friendship as a fundamental human relationship, and this bond that these women have who have trained together and been friends for all these decades.
Yeah, it is.
And so that was easy to draw into too.
Well, and I mean, you're pulling a lot of that from your life. Reading your author note, you have a group of friends from medical school that you're still very much in touch with.
Yeah, we text every week, if not every day. We actually took a trip to Spain in 2019 when I was writing those scenes in the book. We went there. We went to Morocco too, and in my book, the vector for the fictional virus is camels, and so I got to meet some nice disease-free camels in Morocco, and I also met a an author and literary cafe owner and a physician, and stayed in touch with all of them throughout the real world pandemic. And so I could see how they were really doing as I was revising the
Right.
scenes that take place in Spain and Morocco.
It was an interesting added bonus in a time when travel is really difficult. It was like a beautiful little travel novel as well. I
I
mean,
know. Don't I know. Doesn't everybody just missing travel was so hard in 2020.
yeah, even easy travel, even little travel, much less,
Even little
yeah,
travel. I mean, I barely even went to the grocery.
I know. Smaller and smaller our worlds. Um, so I have two writerly questions that I want to ask you. I feel like you got away with two got away. You pulled off two fabulous literary tricks. And one is about your timeline and one is about your point of view. You set up the book after the pandemic. So we meet these women after the pandemic, which um as a reader who was going in nervous, I was like, oh, okay. Like, we know they made it. But you also you create in the first chapter, you know that your main character is going to have to make a choice between her teenager and her, lovely 9-year-old son. Was that the right age? 9? And then
He
throughout,
was 7 to 8 in the
yeah,
book, I think. Maybe 9. Oh, maybe he turned 9. I don't know.
throughout
I don't
the
even know
course,
how old I am.
it's a year. It's
This is
more
too
than a
hard.
year ago. Throughout the course of the book, the teenager is the most teenager, and the little boy is the most delightful little boy. So at like by the time we get to the thing, I'm like, I don't know. The kid clearly. So tell me about deciding to set up that timeline that way, and the way that it added this sort of impending doom that pulled readers through. Tell me, was that the way you had originally thought of it, or was also that an edit?
That was a very deliberate decision because, well, for 2 reasons. First of all, there's this kind of concept that we in literature borrow from Hollywood, which is mirroring an opening scene with a closing scene. And so I knew early on I wanted to start with the friends after the pandemic at this party, and I wanted the book to end at that same party with the same friends, but it sets up the dilemma in the first chapter and it resolves it in the last. And so I kind of knew that those two scenes would be bookends to one another. But also, I knew that if I didn't set up some kind of hook in the beginning of the book, that it would be hard to draw people's attention in, because the scenes that in the very beginning in part one that are set after the pandemic ends, they give way immediately to before the pandemic, which is actually kind of a surprisingly long um, hunk of the book. And that is because, again, there's three protagonists and you have to establish their own storylines, which makes the before, the setting up the normal life before everything goes wrong,
Right.
that makes that section a little longer.
But I felt like that section was so cinematic too, and because we knew what was coming, it was like, God, don't get on that boat, don't go to Morocco. Like it would just
Don't go in the basement with the killer. Yes.
exactly the horror of it, and it also, um, I mean, I guess with that device that you mentioned, but this is true for any book with or any movie with this device. But I felt so specifically about it with your book is that it becomes um, a novel about hindsight almost. Not, I mean, no, like not what would you have done, what could you have done. I mean, they don't grapple with that. They did this thing, and they're just living with the everyday. But it really does make you think about. I mean, particularly us coming out of this pandemic or still being in the pandemic, how the beginning of the pandemic created what we're in now. And it becomes this hindsight thing. I thought that was really powerful. Did you feel that at all while you were editing and watching what was happening unfold?
Yeah. There was a duality to this where, on the one hand, it was really wonderful to be in charge of everything. Like, that's the beauty of fiction. We can end it however we want. We can end it. This pandemic in the book ends. And the
People
other
get
thing,
kits at home. They get like medical kits at home with oxygen. Like, I liked
well,
your,
there was some stuff in the book that was really, I originally wrote it as a cautionary tale, but it evolved into this is what could have been. So we had to decide which of the events and portrayals in the book that did not conform to our deeply weird reality, which of those things we were going to leave and which we would change to be more reflective of what happened. And we decided to leave most everything. I like to say that there's humor in the book, and part of that is that the governmental and societal response to the virus in the book was very unified.
yeah,
Everybody was on the same page about what to do, and they did it. And they had this very strong political leader who was very scientifically literate, a young woman. And so that, that was not the same, obviously, as what we had in real life, but it was so nice to be able to be in control of what happened and to have
yeah.
people do what I wanted them to do.
And provide the things that needed to be, you know, provided on a global scale. Like that would be
Right,
entirely
and I just
satisfying.
read all these books about epidemiology and how ideally you would investigate and constrain an outbreak, and so I just kind of used what was in the books that I had read as far as setting up the societal response.
It's funny. At the beginning of the pandemic, I read The Great Influenza, which is a book that I have had on my bookshelf. I can't even. I don't even know how long. And I read it, and then I went hunting. I went hunting for fiction that would have talked about it, like
Right.
and it was
Nothing.
like there was like a we're never going to talk about this again, and I feel like, and I talked about it at the beginning of the interview. A lot of authors are like, yeah, I don't know, I really
And
don't.
a lot of readers, it's a
Yeah,
hard sell, this book. I think once people read it, they tend to really be into it. And there are some people who are very curious about how a pandemic might have been portrayed before this one that we lived through. But there are other people who are like, nope, not going to
yeah.
read that. And I understand that.
But I think that it's so important. I really do. I feel like, particularly the New York Times article that says that, we've all been languishing. And how I felt that in my soul, how I and my husband and my kids were all languishing, and there's no highs, there's no lows, there's just this like levelness to everything. And the way that your book, while not being our pandemic, reflected our reality back to me was what art is supposed to do. And I cried and I cried, and I'm recommending it to so many people who are like, okay, but I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is exactly the book we need.
Well, and it does end on a note of optimism and hope. And that was not the original ending, by the way. My editor, and she made me change this even before COVID happened, but she said, you can't end with the most
Kill one of
medically
those
thing.
kids.
No one's going to forgive you. So there is
Was it the
a hopeful
teenager?
ending.
You were going to kill the teenager?
I couldn't tell you. I can never say. I have teenagers.
No, you can never say. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. Please finish.
Oh, they have zero interest in ever watching any interviews with me. I don't know why I'm worried. Never gonna see this. I can say what I want, really.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, in the response from readers, as we've all sort of become armchair scientists and medical professionals, um, are you getting that response back to you? Like, are you getting emails from readers who are like, "That's not how it goes. I looked it up."
Well,
I
I live in fear of that. Well, I always get that kind of email no matter what I write. I make a lot of mistakes in my writing, both literary and emotional and medical. And yes, people love to tell you about that. And it usually is helpful, actually, to hear about your mistakes, even though it's humbling. I haven't heard a lot yet from anybody about medical errors, but I had a lot of beta readers who were doctors.
mm,
Lots of ER doctors, lots of infectious disease doctors, handful of virologists and epidemiologists. And either they read the entire manuscript or they read certain scenes or they just answered questions. And some of these people are really famous. So I had good sources. So any mistakes that are remaining are either me taking creative license or I just screwed up and it has nothing to do with my fabulous consultants.
Kimmery, that is a really evolved, um, answer and opinion on your own. On your own. You know, the living in fear of, I have a book that's coming out next year that part of it takes place in nursing school in Iowa in the 60s, and which is basically my mom's story. And I'm just like, man, I'm going to get so many letters. I'm just going to get so many people who are like, that's not how it is. Well, it was for my mother, but anyway. But the other trick that
All literature is subjective. We know
yeah,
this.
the other interesting trick that I think you pulled off was the decision to make Kira's point of view first person and Compton and Hannah's in third. Why did you? What I mean, why I enjoyed it very very much. Can you tell us why you made that decision?
No, I don't remember. I think well, Kira was already written, like she was the first draft of the book
Mhm.
written in first person. I always go back and forth between first and third person. Actually, my first novel had both. My second was entirely third and only had one point of view. And then this one has 3 points of view and 4 timelines, which why I did that, I don't remember anymore.
Awesome.
Like, that just turned out to be a really complicated book to write. But I guess because just to establish that there was a dominant protagonist, maybe. I don't really remember.
That's an interesting thing that's something that you're called to in a lot of your books.
Yeah, I like both. I like writing both ways. And I wish there was some kind of software program that would change pronouns for you because I spend so much time going back and laboriously changing she to I. And, you know,
It's true. It's true. It's one of the worst parts of making that switch. But these are also characters that you have been writing about in all of your books. Um, and you allude to some of the things that have happened to them in the first two books, you know, to different characters. What is the pull back to this group of doctors? And what are the I mean, poor Georgia, right? Like
well, Georgia was the protagonist of the second book. So they are a little bit like spinoffs, not really a series, but it's all set in the same fictional universe. So a main character in one book becomes minor in the next, and the minor character becomes the protagonist of the next, and so forth. And part of that is contractual because my contract with Penguin Random House actually specifies that I have to write medical fiction with a female doctor as the protagonist. So at least for these 3 books, that was locked in. And then I just kind of thought, well, it would be really interesting to see what happened to some of these more peripheral characters in the first story. And that just set me down this path.
oh, that's amazing. That's
Yeah.
really amazing.
Well, and I think when I wrote the first book, which I, by the way, had no experience writing literature at all and no idea how to do it, which is not an approach I would recommend to writing at all because it makes you have to have a massive amount of revision. But my original idea was I wanted to show some of the intensity and the camaraderie that you develop in the medical profession, especially when in those formative years when you're training. And
Mhm.
so that's not a plot at all. And I didn't realize that when I was first writing.
Felt like a plot.
It evolved into a plot eventually, but yeah. So I kind of honed in on this idea of setting and character first before I even knew what I was writing.
Oh, that's really interesting. And part of at the beginning of the book, Kira's asked if uh, she was briefing with the president. She had this sort of like um, big sort of mysterious. We find out about it, what happened at the end. You know, she left her job at the CDC, so she has a bit of fame around her. And she's asked if she would ever write a book, and she talks about how she does write, but it is for her. You know, she journals and she writes down things that are interesting to her. Is that how writing started for you? Like, is that what you were
You
doing?
know, I did keep journals in college, and I really didn't in medical school, and it is probably the biggest regret of my life. I mean, I have a handful of pages of like scratched ideas and little um, anecdotes, but I wish I had because you forget so much, and there is so much literary gold in a career in medicine, and also so much that just affects your ability to empathize with other people and
Mhm.
your awareness of humanity. And it's a fascinating privilege beautiful career. And I wish I had done a better job documenting my own experiences.
Yeah, there really isn't much, I mean, in terms of careers that, like, you think about an ER doctor and the entire range of humanity that you see in the entire range of human experiences, right? Like from tragedy to, joy. Like you are witness to so much. And did you want to be a writer and be a doctor? Like, was that a thing that were two sort of ideas in your head as growing up, or did writing come out of being a doctor?
Well, I think for me, writing came from being a reader because I
Mm,
am an obsessive, devoted reader, just as you are. And I really am in love with the written word, and I wanted to try doing it myself. It wasn't a lifelong goal, though. I didn't think about that in college or when I was younger. And I do feel so blessed to have had these two great career passions. And in some ways, they are completely different. In medicine, you are doing everything you can to alleviate suffering. And in literature, you are deliberately torturing people.
Sophie's choice
So,
is hot zone.
so there are some differences, obviously, but there are also, I think, certain overlaps, and quite a few physicians actually write. And I think it's
Yeah.
what you just said, that we're profoundly affected by um, the vast depth and breadth of humanity that we encounter, and that has to leave its mark on you.
Yeah, and the need to sort of um, um, take some of that off your mind and off your back, right? To put it down and hopefully set it away from yourself. So you have one more book planned. One of the characters in this, so Kira's best friend, is it Vera?
Vani, yes.
Bonnie,
So I think
sorry.
she would make a wonderful protagonist. I don't know if that'll be the next book or the fifth book, but she's an internal medicine doctor in Berea, Kentucky, which is where I grew up. So I don't have to research a whole lot about that. But I think that she would be really interesting. And if you read Doctors and Friends, there are a few little hints sprinkled in there about Vani's background
That's true.
and
I'm excited
some
about
things that
her.
happened in her past. Yeah.
So, you just teased that there might be a different book next. What are you working on right now? Nothing, because it's almost the holidays and
Nothing.
you're zooming every night.
I'm so lame right now. Well, I've been on this book tour, and I have the 3 kids, and like just all hell's breaking loose. I don't know. I gotta wait till after the holidays, but I have been working on a novel set mainly in San Diego, which is where Hannah lives in the book, in
Mhm.
Georgia, um, about a physician. She's an orthopedic surgeon who is married to a biotech venture capitalist whose company is about to go public, just as she unearths something huge in his past that she didn't know about before. So that maybe will be the 4th book, or maybe the Vani one will. I'm not sure.
Wow. Well, I can't wait for either one of them. Either one. Quick. Kimmery, thank you so much for spending the time with us tonight, and thank you very much for this beautiful book. I mean, I can't imagine the roller coaster of putting this book out in this pandemic or in the tail end, wherever we're at in this pandemic. But it is the book we all need to read for real. And I'm going to tell as many people as I can. So thank you for this beautiful book.
Molly, thank you. That is such an honor to hear you say that. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Everybody out there, stay safe, wear a mask, have a drink, read a book. See you next time.
Bye-bye.